Hello, and welcome to UK Paranormal Files. In this episode, we shall take a look at the Dechmont Woods UFO encounter. Most of us with an interest in the paranormal and of alien encounter stories will have some idea of what a typical UFO sighting or interaction with aliens is like. There are some common or perhaps signature threads to many accounts. Although that is somewhat true of the Dechmont Woods UFO encounter, this account contains some very peculiar and very unique details. On the 9th of November 1979, Robert Taylor was out walking in the woods with his dog Lara. He by all accounts was a man of good reputation and had served in World War II and was considered by those who knew him to be a war hero. He was a typical hard-working Scotsman, solid in personality and reputation, and a regular churchgoer. Mr. Taylor was employed as a forestry worker for the Livingston Development Corporation. On this particular day, he and his dog had parked up on a side road near the M8 motorway at about 10:30 a.m. They had set out to check some of the fences and gates at Dechmont Law. They walked down a forest track and rounded a corner into an opening on a route they were both familiar with. In front of the pair was a sight that was truly from out of this world. Mr. Taylor had stumbled upon a UFO hovering just above the ground. He described the craft as being a broadly circular-shaped metallic object with a rim which wrapped around the craft that was rotating. It was dark grey in colour, and it was approximately 20 feet wide, with protrusions at the base that resembled landing legs. For a moment the man stood still in awe, and after the initial shock had been absorbed, the former serviceman, without fear and in a mind of curiosity, began cautiously to step nearer to the seemingly alien craft. After a few cautious steps of his approach, he began to hear a strange mechanical banging sound that seemed to emanate from within the craft. Although the man approached with courage, his faithful companion Lara remained glued to the spot. And as the craft began making noises, his loyal friend began barking nervously to alert its owner that danger was near. The man ignored the pleas of his dog and inched ever still a little more closer. Suddenly, from the base of the craft, two smaller metallic orbs emerged. These spheres were covered in metallic spikes and rolled towards him at speed, bouncing across the ground. There was a distinct popping sound as the spikes penetrated the earth. Mr. Taylor turned and ran, but he could not outpace these two spheres, which grounded him violently. The objects attached themselves to Mr. Taylor's legs, tearing his trousers and piercing his flesh. Through the pain and the terror of attempting to power his way out of the restraints, he became aware of an incredibly repugnant and noxious smell and a hissing noise. The two spheres then began to drag the completely helpless man by the legs towards the larger vessel from which they had been launched. Mr. Taylor was dragged across the floor, and he soon lost consciousness. In later accounts he let it be known that he thought the foul smell had been some form of gas that had rendered him unconscious. Eventually Mr. Taylor awoke in the woodland clearing. He was groggy and was feeling pain from numerous physical injuries that he had sustained. Mr. Taylor would later calculate that he was unconscious for about 20 minutes, and although he had absolutely no memories from being unconscious, he assumed that those smaller spheres had dragged him on board that larger vessel, for reasons which were unknown. Now awake and groggy, he tried to get to his feet, but his balance and coordination had not returned. He stumbled a little and tried to get his thinking straight in his head again. He had a deep aching in his legs. The vessel and the smaller spheres had disappeared, but he was horror-stricken, and he knew he had to get away from the sight. In briefly surveying his surroundings, He could see strange markings in the ground, which had not been there what seemed like just moments before. Weak and disorientated, he finally found his feet, and with Lana began to stagger back to his car, which was about 530 yards away. He stumbled along the way and put in as quick a pace as he could muster. When back at the car, his first instinct was to get onto the radio and summon some help. But as he opened his mouth to speak and plead for help and assistance, no words were coming out. He had been rendered temporarily mute by the encounter, possibly by the noxious gas that had rendered him unconscious just minutes earlier. He eventually got himself and Lara into the car, only to find he was unable to start it, and he realised he would need to make the trip home on foot. When he eventually arrived home, his wife found him in a dishevelled state. His clothes were muddy and torn. He had regained his voice, although it was a strain to talk. He expressed that he had been attacked by a spaceship. She quickly phoned for both the police and a doctor, then began to administer first aid to the apparent wounds on her beloved husband's chin and legs. Eventually the doctor arrived and suggested a visit to the hospital. A suggestion which was heeded initially. However, after not being seen for 2 hours, Mr. Taylor headed home and never got fully medically checked out. The police took Mr. Taylor's statement, and as an upstanding man of good reputation, did so professionally and took the incident seriously. However, their initial assumptions were that of a common assault, and proceeded to investigate on that basis. Detective Constable Ian Wark led the case. They returned to the site under Mr. Taylor's directions and saw for themselves, and then logged, the disturbances in the ground, which were the same as Mr. Taylor had observed at the site as he had been regaining consciousness. There were 2 long ladder-shaped markings cut into the ground, surrounded by many smaller circular holes of about 3.5 inches in diameter each. Reports vary as to how many of these holes there were, but it's generally reported as being between 32 and 40. These smaller holes were thought to have been made by the smaller spheres, which Mr. Taylor had described to police as looking like Second World War mines, something he would have been familiar with from his service days. Police searched the area and established that these smaller holes were only found in the area in and around where Mr. Taylor had been assaulted. The police theorised that the tracks had been made by heavy equipment. Detective Wark said, "These marks just arrived. They did not come from anywhere or go anywhere. They just arrived as though a helicopter or something had landed from the sky." Detective Wark suspected that the ladder tracks were likely the remnants of caterpillar tracks used on heavy machinery such as a bulldozer. However, despite a detailed search, there were no signs of how or where the supposed heavy machinery would have entered or exited the area. The Livingston development company who Mr. Taylor worked for had a host of heavy equipment in use and locally based. So the equipment was all checked to identify which piece of equipment might have made the indentations in the ground, but none were found to be a close match. The clothes Mr. Taylor had been wearing were subjected to forensic analysis. After months of analysis, forensic scientists concluded the rips in Mr. Taylor's trousers were most likely the result of something hooking into them, followed by a sharp upward pull. It was also deemed unlikely the hardy-wearing material could have been ripped through snagging in a bush. Mr. Taylor had been in generally good health until this point, and was not someone prone to seizures or hallucinations. He had had a bout of meningitis 14 years before this experience. The treatment for this was successful, but he did return to hospital shortly afterwards with headaches, but those soon passed. This case has the distinction of being the only known case in the UK where there was a formal police investigation following the UFO incident. The investigation itself centred around a suspected common assault, but the details and forensics were recorded in the normal way. Detective Wark has never stated that he believed for sure that Mr. Taylor was assaulted by an extraterrestrial craft, and told the BBC, "I'd have to see it myself to believe it." However, as part of his investigation, he interviewed Mr. Taylor on 3 occasions, and at no time did he change his story. He stated he believed what he saw, and there was no way he would make that up. And when asked if Mr. Taylor's experience can be explained by epileptic fit, the detective concludes, "But what about the marks on the ground?" This seems to be in reference to the fact that there was no evidence of an entry or exit point for heavy machinery to have damaged the ground. It seems we can infer from his comments that Detective Wark believed Mr. Taylor's account to be true, and could not substantiate an earthly explanation for his attack. As we covered in the introduction, there are some elements to this case that make it somewhat unique. There are some classic parts of this story also that accord with other UFO encounters. Sight of a craft seemingly not of this world. Witness experiences missing time and or loss of memory. However, the very mechanical function and description of this particular craft strikes me as being a little more low-tech, for lack of a better expression, compared to other UFO sighting accounts. The use of floating metallic spheres and gas to subdue Mr. Taylor also seems different and unusual. But in a conversation about alien encounters and abduction cases, what the heck is normal? The curiousness of this case is in trying to figure out what the purpose of it was. The craft, and the being or beings we assume to be in control of it, seem to have either had malicious intent, or for some reason reacted very aggressively upon being spotted by Mr. Taylor. And let's be in no doubt here, this was a physical assault that probably also took a mental toll on the poor man for some time afterwards. If it was their purpose or mission to find a human, any human, then why pick the remote woodland? Why would they need someone to assault in such a bizarre way? This assault itself seemingly must have been to disarm and subdue their target, but why? Was Mr. Taylor specifically targeted? Again, if so, why? What purpose would this encounter serve to those beings or to Mr. Taylor himself? I am at a loss for a logical explanation, but my best guess is that if Mr. Taylor truly did have an encounter, it was likely unplanned, and he caught this vessel and its inhabitants off guard, and they responded accordingly. As is somewhat common with other cases, there is sometimes a hint of randomness, that a vessel might be damaged or sighted unintentionally, and perhaps that is the case here too. Are we so insignificant to these beings that they feel they can freely swing by and do this to a man and leave him injured and distressed? Sometimes in conversation people will speculate why aliens don't talk to humans, and an analogy is thrown up that we just wouldn't understand them. It would be like us trying to talk to ants or to a cat. In a similar analogy, I question if we are seen as so insignificant and puny that our individual and collective wills can be so freely ignored. If so, when humankind really does venture out into the universe, or crosses the dimensional planes, we must surely be ready to find ourselves outfought, outgunned and out-teched, and very much a junior player in whatever cosmic order may exist. Skeptics have been critical of this case, as they usually are. The chief theory is that Mr. Taylor had a seizure of some kind and hallucinated or dreamt the experience up. His previous meningitis illness is cited as a possible root cause. If that were the case, then this would prove to be a single and isolated seizure, not fated to be repeated in the life of Mr. Taylor. And as Detective Wark pointed out, this explanation still leaves unanswered questions. Another sceptical explanation for one point was that PVC pipes were at some point laid under an adjacent field, and that storage of those pipes may have been in the woodland clearing, causing the latterly observed indentations in the ground. It is not clear to me if the timeline was ever established to fit, but that would lead to some further questions, such as why Mr. Taylor, who by all accounts was honest and trustworthy, had claimed the indentations appeared during his unconscious spell, and how between the Livingston Developmental Company and the police, they were unable to establish these facts and come to the same conclusion. Forensic investigations by the police concluded that if the ladder-shaped tracks were made by machinery, it must have weighed several tons. In which case, I doubt that the supposed PVC piping weighs a sufficient amount to have made those tracks. But if I am wrong, and it did, then why did the police not find an entry or exit point to the clearing? As if they were of a significant weight, or if something else had been there that itself was of a significant weight, then machinery would have been required to move it, and there was no evidence that had been the case. Lastly, as a forest worker who was patrolling the area, are we to suppose that Mr. Taylor nor his employers knew nothing of such an arrangement? A final sceptical argument might be a more plausible one, that Mr. Taylor may have been exposed to a chemical that caused him to pass out or have a mini-stroke. By his own account, he did recall a strong, noxious smell during the assault, and it is said there is a nearby tower that might have been visible to him, which in a state of distress and whilst losing consciousness could have been mistaken for the craft. In a confused and poisoned state, as he passed out, a false set of images may have been hallucinated, then recorded as memories. I do not dismiss this explanation entirely, but it does again leave some unanswered questions. The Livingston Development Company were at the time engaged in a lot of building activity in the area for what is now known as Livingston Newtown, and although I won't claim to be an expert on the matter, I would assume that they would be somewhat aware of the terrain and its geographical features. For example, the effects of radon gas have been known since the 1950s, so I think it's fair to conclude that if there was a general risk of natural chemical exposure, there would be something of an awareness either around then or detected since then, and it seems after many years this has not been the case. The police and forensics found no such source, and as common assault and epilepsy were considered, it seems likely they would have analysed the area for anything unusual. No source or residue of unusual gas or chemicals were recorded. Add to that the fact that Mr. Taylor's clothes were also forensically analysed, and no trace of toxins or chemicals was logged. And if chemicals or toxins were in play, how come Lara was seemingly unaffected? Mr. Taylor passed away in 2007 at 88 years of age. At the site of his encounter, a plaque has been erected which reads, "This is the site referred to in Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World, which describes an encounter with a forestry worker out walking and what appeared to him as an unidentified flying object." It is impossible to look at this case in a reasonably open-minded way and conclude with 100% certainty that Mr. Taylor was indeed visited upon and assaulted by an alien craft. However, we have a witness who seems tremendously trustworthy and reliable, and all other supposed logical explanations seem to need some shoehorning to make them fit, or at least they do in my estimation. It is, as always, for you to make your own minds up, dear viewers, but I don't mind sharing that on reflection of the details of this case, it seems more likely to me that Mr. Taylor did indeed encounter a hostile extraterrestrial craft on that cold November morning in 1979. His curiosity and seemingly steely character in approaching the craft seems extraordinary to me, to have the courage to see something completely outside our frame of reference and understanding, and possibly outside our usual consciousness, and as a God-fearing man decide to walk up to it, to explore or try to understand it. I am not sure I could have summoned the courage to have done so myself, and now that I have reviewed the details of this man's encounter, I would resolve not to do so, should such a similar encounter be thrust upon me at some point in my future. If you've enjoyed this video, please click the thumbs up button. It's not only nice for me to see, but more educated folk tell me that it's a great way to get YouTube and its infamous algorithm to feature my videos more prominently in their search and recommendation features. Please feel free to leave me a comment and let me know what you think about this encounter. Do you think that Mr. Taylor had a genuine experience, or do you think there is some more earthly explanation for what he recalled? And if you haven't already, it would be greatly appreciated if you click the subscribe button and follow the channel. There's a bell icon too, that if you click you can receive notifications when new videos are released. Lastly, you can help spread the word about this channel by clicking one of the share icons below the video and sharing with your friends on social media. As always, thanks very much for watching.